Hi. Today I'd like to talk to you about the 2011 earthquake off the coast of Japan and how it affected Nissan Motor Company. First, I want to talk about the explanation of the situation, and then I will analyze the relevant issues, and then I will offer my recommendations for what Nissan could have done to improve their situation. In March of 2011, the 9.0 magnitude earthquake shook the Pacific Ocean off the Japanese coast, and what followed devastated Japan. It took its toll of 25,000 dead, missing, or injured Japanese citizens and left its scar on businesses across the world. Nissan Motor Company was one of these businesses. Nissan manufactured 20% of its parts in Japan, the other 80% in the US. So its primary issue was parts allocation. They needed to find a way to find parts for their cars from other locations. The relevant issues are as follows. The most pressing issue that Nissan faced was parts allocation. Um, 6 of their production facilities were damaged, as well as 50 of their suppliers in the tsunami and the earthquake. The disaster was a catalyst for future production issues because the materials had to be sourced from elsewhere. What Nissan had to overcome was 3 of the 7 obstacles outlined in our textbook, Introduction to Leadership Concepts and Practices by Peter G. Nordhaus. The first obstacle they had to overcome was unclear goals. Nissan overcame this obstacle through preparedness of the situation. They knew the disaster would come. They ran earthquake simulations in the previous years for their Japanese employees, and they activated their global disaster headquarters only 15 minutes after the earthquake had struck. Their second obstacle was unclear direction. Though this situation was complex, and Nissan is a large global corporation, it was clear what Nissan had to do to keep production moving. The third obstacle they overcame was complex tasks. Luckily, though this was indeed a complex task, Nissan had prepared for this kind of disaster and quickly moved to solve their supply problems. The obstacles to their goal of mitigating the effect of the disaster on overall production are presented in this case study. First, they shared information with their regional managers, and then they worked to allocate their supplies. They dealt with production management, and then they delegated executive powers to their regional managers. Additionally, since the focus here was supply from other locations instead of Japan, Nissan's leadership became incredibly task oriented. Now I will provide my 2 recommendations for how Nissan could have helped them mitigate this crisis. Throughout the semester, we have dealt with leadership over people. In this situation outlined in the study, Nissan is dealing with, yes, maintaining strong leadership in the face of disaster, but also conflict with the forces of nature. What I propose is a 2-step process that would have helped Nissan in the face of their supply issues. And I have tailored my steps to revolve around leadership theories. I will provide my recommendation and argument within each step. And then afterwards, I will provide a rationale for my 2 recommendations. The first recommendation I suggest Nissan should have taken is handling conflict with communication. Conflict is usually a result of poor communication, and the situation Nissan faced was a result of the content dimension of conflict, which Nordhaus explains as involving the objective, observable aspects such as money, weather, and land. In an article titled Why Communication is Key to Supply Chain Success on Oxford College of Procurement and Supply.com, they recommend one step to improving supply chain communication by producing a list of options and relevant cases that back up each. Now, this article mainly applies to stakeholders, but it can be applied to the situation of simple parts allocation. I believe Nissan could have mitigated their supply chain issues if they had source buyers for parts in addition to the earthquake training they required of their Japanese employees, so that when disaster did strike, they weren't scrambling to try to find parts from other places. My second recommendation is rewarding results. In chapter 8 of our textbook, Nordhaus explains the 3 R's of excellence: require results, reviewing results, and rewarding results. And rewarding results is simply when a leader rewards group members for achieving results. In an article by Femke de Fader titled Workplace Stress and Reward, a case study of mental health workers' experiences, she speaks to motivation in the workplace on page 18 when she says, extensive research has shown that consequences shape human behavior. Thus, if a good behavior is recognized, noticed, or rewarded, then that behavior tends to positively repeat itself. Now, this is more a recommendation for after the supply chain issues have been fixed, but it will help resolve the issue of any further motivation problems for employees that felt that their efforts had gone unrecognized during such a stressful time. Now, my rationale for these steps. My rationale for my first recommendation was that I developed it solely on the primary issue at hand, which was supply allocation. The lack of vehicle parts required to keep the company running smoothly as possible. This does, however, lead into my second recommendation because with so much focus on production, Nissan was likely more devoted to keeping the company running smoothly instead of providing relief effort to the local communities in Japan and also keeping an eye on the morale of their global workforce. My second recommendation, my rationale for my second recommendation was out of this evident lack of relationship-oriented leadership. There was no mention in the case study whether or not they kept an eye on the morale of their workforce or what they did to keep motivation high. It's assumed that their motivation was high because this was a disaster situation. But while Nissan's first efforts were to determine how their employees in Japan were doing, and their secondary efforts to mitigate supply chain allocation, essentially stayed on production. They didn't seem to follow up on how the employees were doing in their global workforce. It's important to strike a balance between task and relationship oriented leadership because during a crisis, as Joseph E. Trainer and Lucia Velati suggest in their article, Leadership in Crises, Disasters, and Catastrophes, there is an increasing awareness of how important it is that emergency management considers how private sector actions improve disaster outcomes. If Nissan put more effort into finding alternative sources for their supply before this happened, in addition to the earthquake training they required their Japanese employees to get, then they could have had a greater influence on disaster relief efforts as well as maintaining morale within their workforce. Hell hath no fury like a 9.0 earthquake. Today, I outlined the disaster situation Nissan faced in 2011, the steps they took to mitigate the effects of the disaster, and finally, my recommendation for how they could have improved their situation. Thank you.